Hello again, and welcome to the second part of our Drawing with Particles project. In this one, we're going to actually look at sort of a different technique for drawing things onto objects or in your scene, and that's actually using stencils. So you can see here we've got a spline, which is actually sort of a stencil shape. If I hide these other objects just whilst I'm talking about this, and you can see here we've got this stencil shape. Now the actual logo is this part here. It's this outside part, and then these kind of, actually in fact if I drop it into an extrude we'll be able to tell better. So I'm holding down Alt whilst I select and add an extrude object, and it'll make it a child. It'll make the logo a child. Then I'm going to make sure it's 0 movement, and you can see here we've got this any shipping company logo stencil, and I might add a material to that just so that we can just have a bit of contrast, I guess. There we go. And yeah, there we go. So this is going to be, you can see now which parts are going to be sort of paint will go through these. So the particles are going to go through this side and leave that imprint, hopefully, on a surface. And that surface is actually going to be, if we unhide our shipping container, it's actually going to be the side of the shipping container because it currently doesn't have any logo, and obviously boss will probably want some logos on it. So we're going to try that. So I think the first thing, oh, and also in this scene, by the way, I've actually brought in from the last project the part, the emitting the X-Particles drawing, because I think we're going to use this to actually target our spray can at our stencil. So that's why that's in here. Reset PSR on that one. There we go. And then let's just hide it. Perfect. And like I said, let's start preparing this surface for colliding particles, because currently it's not too bad. And if I'm going to just create a duplicate of this. So I'm just going to copy it, Control C, Control V, and then I'm going to hide the original just so I can see what I'm working with here. And if we look around this piece of geometry, and if I go into a wireframe, you can see it's pretty good. Looks absolutely fine. It's double thickness, so that's not so great, but we can kind of thin that out. But also there's these moments here. Can you see that this is actually, these are sort of separate parts, and this is quite common. Say you had a CAD model where you wanted particles to collide with it. You're not going to get perfectly topologized, perfect topology on any of the CAD meshes. You'll rarely find that. So generally there's always going to be some prep work for this. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to make this editable. I might change some settings. So if we look down here, I can create a single object. And if I make this editable, and then go down in there and make this part editable as well, what we're going to do is we're going to extract the front faces of each of these, so to avoid having the back panes on there. So I'm going to use it's called the Fong break selection. So if you type in Fong break selection, I've got it set to U and then N, shortcut. And what this will do is this will look for edge breaks. Now these are things that you can put into a model to change the shading. We don't want it to do that, so I'm actually going to I'm going to override the Fong tag, which all it's doing is it means it's looking for any angles lower than 15 or edge breaks. Go back to the tool, UN. I'm going to drop the Fong angle down quite low. Probably as low as I can before I start seeing other stuff coming in. There we go. And then I'm just going to select each of these. So 1, 2, 3, 4. And we're not going to use these. We're not going to actually use these, this geometry. I'm going to actually create a proxy geometry, and we're going to kind of conform it to this surface. But before we do that, I was just going to prepare this surface. Oh, we've selected the back faces here. Let's have a look at what we've got. This is quite a common thing, like I said. So some of these actually have a rounded edge. They shouldn't do, but if we can actually just get rid of those. If we, I'm going to use UL for loop, then UF for fill. Oops, wrong button. There we go. And I'm just going to backspace, kill that off. I'm going to do the same on this one. So the reason that the Fong, the Phong selection tool there wasn't working is that those are rounded edges. So let's double check. See, now we're not selecting the back. What about that one? Correct. Good. 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 What about this one? Is this going to behave? Yep. So I've selected the front faces. Now I just need to invert the selection. So I could just run the invert command, UI, and then hit backspace, and that'll delete that away. So now we've got these single walled. So if I actually put this material on just to show you, and I click side and I hit front, and we can see that that is now a 1 poly thick object. And that'll just help with what I'm about to do next. And that is to add a collider deformed mesh. So what I mean by that, I'm going to turn on our, oh, that's matching colors now. So if I put this up to here, now our stencil's going to get painted, but it might actually catch some sort of particles or stuff, some spray going outside. So we want to create a collider that is bigger than the stencil itself, but as efficient as possible. So let's go into this view, front view, and I'm going to add a plane. Let's make it Z+, bring it up. Actually, jump into the top view. There we go. If I just go to wireframe, actually, we'll be able to see. Well, sort of. We could always color this one. There we go. I tend to give stuff geometry colors. If you saw the shipping container, it's multicolored. It just helps navigate a scene better. I find you can see which objects are separated, etc. Okay, so one thing I should note before I decide on this size of this geometry, I do think that we're going to have, well, actually I know because I've planned this, is that after we've sprayed this on, we're going to actually use that XP tag and we're going to spray paint over this freestyle. So we are going to need a catch surface that's going to be big enough to catch that as well. So if we actually grab one of those splines that had our graffiti, now that makes sense maybe. Let's grab the target. Make sure that's in front of the mesh as well. And obviously that's too large, so let's shrink it down. So I think, well, I just wanted to go over the NE part, I think, and then that will look quite cool. I hope. Something like that. And that'll stay quite tight to that, so that would be fine. There we go. Something like that. Perfect. So that's just a roughing in of that shape. Let's do. What color shall I do for that one? Running out of colors. There we go. So yeah, we're going to spray that on later on, but for now I just wanted to make sure I have enough surface here that's going to cover it all, but not be too large. And you want to be as efficient as possible with colliders. XP is pretty efficient because it'll actually only sample the area where the particles are, or it won't, it's not very high res around the area. So it's not really a problem for that, but later on we're going to be using vertex maps and generating wet map stuff. So that you definitely want to be as efficient as possible. So what if I do 140, something like that? Quite tight in. There we go. I just like round numbers as well. And now, in terms of the subdivisions, we want it to be quite highly subdivided, especially later on when we're dealing with those things. But for now, I'm just going to set it to probably, if we do half the centimeter value, so our squares, our polygons are going to be 2 centimeters by 2 centimeters. So if I do 140 divided by 2, 70. If I just wireframe that, you'll see how dense that is. So that's quite dense. And that's going to be useful for conforming this to that surface as well. So let's hide some stuff because it's getting a bit cluttered in our viewport. So let's hide our corrugated side. Actually, no, we need that. Let's hide we can turn that off. And we can even turn the logo off for now. Cool. So this is where we need to conform this to that surface. And I think that blue's a little dark to see the shape. Okay. And so what we'll do is we'll grab a collider or collision deformer, drop that in there, and then we'll drag our corrugated side as a collider object inside that collision object. Now if we move this towards here, not much is going to happen. It's doing an intersect, but it tends not to, can work if the proximity is close enough, but it doesn't look like it's even reacting to that, so it's not working. So inside stretch is quite a good one. If we keep pushing this through. Oh, it should have held it there. Oh, there we go. So I tell you what's happening here is our plane is the wrong way around. So it's currently Z positive. So we need it to be Z negative. And then this time it'll allow us to push this way. So can you see that? I'm pushing it and it's forming the shape. This is a really very powerful workflow. If you need to quickly create a collider, retopologize something quickly, using the collision deformer or even the shrink wrap does in a pinch. But for this, I'd recommend using this. If we look at the top view, and that's in, so weirdly, so if we look, that's our plane, but you can still see the plane for some reason. We're actually probably in isopalm mode. So if we go display, we're viewing isopalms. If I turn that off, you'll see the actual wireframe and the deformed mesh. Okay, so can you see how it's kind of smoothing out and it's not quite fully adhering to that surface? Well, if we go to the collision object, deformer I should say, go to the advanced tab, we can change the size down to 0. We don't want it to stretch really. Stretching is going to deform it and make it look a bit weird. Don't need the relaxed steps, that kind of stuff. There we go. And if we drop the stiffness and structural stuff right down as well, then it becomes just a surface kind of deformer thing. Okay. So, I'm just wondering if I can get that any closer. It doesn't really matter. Once we've got this shape, we can push it towards it even more, so that's fine. Okay, so now we've got that, I'm going to make that editable. So right click, well, actually I'll do current state to object. And then we can keep this in the scene. And I tend to have a folder maybe in my scene called construction. And it just is stuff that I want to keep in case I need to come back and reuse it. But I'm going to generally going to create a mesh from it anyway, an editable mesh from it. Okay, so you can see our axis is a little bit off as well, so we might want to just move that towards there. So let's just use Z, push it towards, nice and close, and now it's hugging that surface. But it's nice and dense, and we've got these even-sized, you see this? Nice even-sized polygons, and that's going to be really important later for our vertex maps. Okay, so let's call this our, I guess it's the container collider. And we could actually hide the corrugated side for now. Excellent. And the good thing about this is because it came from a plane, this has a UV. So that's going to be useful later when if we want to apply textures to it and that kind of thing. And if you want to bake things out as well, that kind of stuff. But let's actually get into making this into a collider. So let's make it a collider in our original system. So let's grab some of these. So our path target, let's bring that back in here actually. Oh, we could use those actually, that's fine. And our source is over here. There we go. Because I haven't gone back to 0 is why these particles are up here, by the way. And remember, the closer, it needs to be close to the surface that it's going to collide to if you want it to represent accurately, because it's going to target that. Let's just make sure everything's set up correctly. The spray paint is on. Let's press play, see if anything happens. Yeah, we go straight through because obviously we have no collider on here. So we need to swap out this collider for our container collider. And that's not working either. And I can tell you that's more than likely because we're looking at the back face or the front face. And we set this, I think, to inside. Yeah. So outside. Classic. There we go. And there we go. We start drawing onto our surface. And you can see it's kind of conforming to the mesh there. Oh, do you notice this also? Our particles are stood off really far. So that's because our subframe steps. So if you hit Control or Command D, increase your subframe steps. That's where all the magic happens. So now we get a much more accurate conforming surface. I thought that was looking a bit thick on there, but yeah. Okay. And there we go. So that's actually an initial setup for something that we're going to use later on. So for now, I'm actually going to keep that in position. I might bring our container collider out of this system and make it a bit more of a universal thing. So it's going to be shared between a couple of systems. So this one is going to be called it's currently called spray paint. Let's call it our XP graffiti. And I'm going to just turn it off for now. And also, let's just hide those splines. In fact, let's create a subfolder in the other objects. Splines. Just means we can keep things nice and tidy. There we go. And I'm just going to hide those. So that system is now sort of dormant. But I want to utilize pretty much everything inside that in a new system. So I'm going to duplicate this whole system here. And I'm going to call this one any shipping logo. There we go. Could have called it just stencil or something like that. Let's give it a different color, of course. Maybe a yellow for that. And then let's turn it on. And let's make sure, well, now we're going to be using different splines. So first of all, we're not using this spline. So let me explain. So we're going to be using we don't need to follow this. We don't need to trace these edges. We don't need to trace it perfectly. We just need to kind of create, as you would in real life, you'd be moving. This is why I wanted to do this technique actually, is you want to spray the particles along this and you want them to be caught by the stencil and then they'll hit the surface behind, leaving just the positive areas. Or negative areas, I should say, actually. So what we'll do is let's put that under there. And the stencil, I'm going to bring that in here as well. And I might put that in its own subfolder, just so that we've got it sort of separated. And this one's going to have a collider on it, a collider tag as well. So we could actually just copy that collider tag. There we go. And remember, this is actually driving actions. These colliders are driving actions and stuff. So currently there's actions in the other system, but there's also this one. So I might just grab this one, freeze particles action. Now we've got 2 in here, and that's because I copied this collider tag to this one because I wanted to do the same. If I double click this top one, you'll see that it's down in here, and we don't want that. So let's turn this to, let's get rid of that one. There we go. And if I press play now, we'll actually collide with this. Can you see that? We're actually colliding with that surface. But the one in the background, the container collider, is no longer freezing the particles. Well, it is freezing the particles, but it's only freezing the particles in this system. And that freeze particles action is actually turned off. So we definitely need to have a freeze particles action in here as well. And because they're the same name, we want to be a bit careful and maybe name this one Stencil. And name this one Graffiti. Now, it doesn't really matter. I could use them both, or I could use one and cross-pollinate across the systems. But for ease of, if you wanted to transfer this into another scene, you might end up with problems. Okay, so you can see something's happening. And if we just hide the stencil, actually, something's happening, but it's kind of hard to see what's going on because we're actually drawing the word X-Particles over the top. But it is capturing, you can see that stencil is catching particles. So we want to make this a lot clearer. So let's grab our splines, and I'm going to delete them both. Remember this, if you recall, this is all linked up to this cloner here. So we'll rename this cloner Stencil. Okay. Jump back here. And I'm actually just going to delete these 2. We don't need those. And I'm going to go to the front view. I'm just going to add that material back on so it's nice and clear. And then I'm going to get a sketch spline. And I'm actually just going to doodle like a path that I want my spray to go along. So here we go. Let's start up this side. And you kind of want to be pretty consistent with this. It's up to you. I mean, I'm going to go into here. So I'm going to actually start going in here where we're not going to hit that edge at all. But what we'll do, and you can let up at any point because it does continue, the spline does continue across. So it'll jump from the end here. And then we'll start again up here. And we'll do the whole edge. Let's see if I can do this without letting up. It doesn't matter if you do, you can always just use the standard spline editing tools to add points and move them around. We will definitely be doing that later. There we go. Now that might need a double run on the outside, I'm not 100% sure yet, so we'll test this out. But you can see this is going to be our target. Oops. Hit a shortcut there. So target. And let's move that towards our... There we go. Now, just for convenience, I tend to like to have the axis centered on the object. So I'm going to just go to mesh and use our axis center. And I tend to hit center axis 2 because the default is just center the axis to all points. And that's what that does. Now I'm just going to duplicate that. We don't need to, and I'll explain later, but we will. And I'm just going to scale that down and we'll call this source. And then of course we're going to replace these in the cloner. So cloner needs to have a source and a target spline, or a rail spline if you like. And then if we press play now, it should utilize this spline. Now you can see it's going insanely fast, and then it's actually looping around several times. And if you recall, we were using splines that had loads of segments last time, whereas this one only has two, I think only 2 segments. If we go to mode, project info, selection, yeah. So our spline only has 2 segments, and yet we are telling the stencil to travel like 1400%, I believe, whereas now it only needs to go 200% to the finishing point. So if we select this keyframe, you can see it's let's drop it from 1399.9 to just nearly 200%. And there we go. You'll see it's moving. Now you'll see it's kind of chopping around a little bit, and it's sort of unevenly paced. That's because the spline itself is using, if I click on the spline, it's using an adaptive subdivision mode, so there's actually not very even numbers of points. If I put a matrix on this, or actually if I just extrude, you'll see. Can you see as I extrude, you can see there's big areas where there's no subdivisions, and then there's areas where there's loads, so especially around those curves. We want it to be way more even than that, so I'm going to say use a uniform, and straight away you can see we've got much more even division. And I'm going to do the same on our target, and then I'm just going to get rid of that. And we should be back to a more even pacing. There we go. And remember, the animation might have keyframes in it as well. But that is doing as we've asked it. But there is one problem you might be seeing, and that's the fact that it is very focused in. It's like a laser on that area, and we want it to spread out way more than this. So one thing to make this a lot clearer, by the way, I should, on the stencil collider, for the action on that, it's currently changing the color, or it's trying to change the color, but it's not. We're not seeing a change in color at all, and the reason for that is that the original emitter has a gradient selected. So if we change this to single color, we should see them change white. There we go. So let's make the stencil ones change to like a slightly different yellow, just so we know that they're related to that. Wow, that's really imperceptible. There we go. It looks like, by the way, yeah, we might need to use 2 freezes. Well, actually, I'll explain some stuff later on. That's fine. So we're going to probably change groups on one of these, and it'll be the stencil one. So I digress. Currently, it's set to squares. That's perfect. And yeah, there we go. Press play. But it's currently a laser. So if I hide the stencil, you can see it's not really representing our logo, our stenciled logo. So what we need to do, and you may have got ahead of me on this one, is we need to spread the particles out more. So if I go to particle direction and I increase this random blend, we'll get a more spread out set of particles. Still not enough. Go for that. And also let's add way more particles. Let's do 20,000. There we go. So there we go. You can see how it's spreading them out. Still focusing them in at the beginning there quite a lot, so we might need to tweak that. But you're getting an idea here. In fact, if I increase this side as well to make sure we get no sharp parts. There we go. That's ensuring that we have a decent spread. Probably too much right now, but we'll see. Could maybe hide the stencil again. That's cool. Let's actually change the display of the stencil ones. And we'll do that. In fact, we'll just do what we're going to do later on anyway. Let's change the group as it collides with this stencil as well, so we can do different stuff to the stencil particles and the container collided particles. So let's add another action. And I held control there just so that when I added it, I stayed connected to this. I didn't need to do that, but that's fine. Go to this editor, display, and actually I'm going to turn off the display in the freeze. Go back to editor display. Now we're going to change this to a direct action, and we're going to change group. So let's go to our emitter, and let's just check everything's good. Yep. I'm going to create and add a group. And this one we're going to call, let's call this spray can group, because it's the first group that comes out of the spray can. And then the one that hits the stencil is going to be called stencil group. And then we'll have a third group, might not need this, but we'll create it whilst we're here, called painted group. So it's the actual logo. And we'll just give that a different color as well. Just trying to make sure they don't all blend together. Let's go back to our change group action. And we're going to change it to new group, stencil group. So when it collides with this surface here, it's going to trigger the action, two actions. It's going to trigger the freeze. It's also going to go to change group, hopefully. And we should be able to see that if... let's check what color. Oh yeah, so the stencil can group is yellow. Just to double check that, just for a sanity check, I'm just going to change it to like a really vivid red. There we go. Currently that's dots. Change it to squares. I think it's forcing the display, by the way. So if I go to display tab, yeah. So I had it on forced display, which was probably messing up the fact that it's squares. There we go. Squares are just a bit easier to see as a display mode. But you're really starting to see the contrast now in the actual logo. So the red ones are actually stuck to the stencil and being prevented or occluded like a light ray would be from a shadow. There we go. From that, and then if I just, in fact, let's take the stencil group and change it to none. So actually, it's almost like it's killing them off. And then we'll actually see what's landing underneath the stencil. Oh, that's interesting. Is that? I think we might be spreading the particles too much. So let's... That, or they're actually getting through, which I don't think they are. Let's double check what's going on here. Interesting. The particles are actually getting through. So let's do some diagnosing. Let's show the stencil group. No, that's quite interesting. So we're actually getting particles going through this stencil shape. Let's try any collision. Oh, yeah, it was that. So it was behaving as if this surface was inverted. So let me just double check that. If I change this to front, okay. So we were actually hitting the back of the surface of this collider, and I'm going to leave this issue in the video because I think it's good to kind of catch these and see how they're worked out. So we need to change this. We could do two things here. We can flip this geometry, which I think I'll probably do. So we go to Object tab, and we can just go flip normals. Flip normals, check it on the outside, and just, yeah. Yeah, there we go. Or is it? Are we back to the same problem we had before? Go to none. Yeah, back to the same problem. So the flip normals, interestingly, doesn't work. So all we'll do is we'll change the collider to inside mode. And now we'll be properly stenciling. And you're starting to see how cool this effect can actually be. And we're painting the logo onto that surface. Excellent. And I'll just let it run, and we'll see it hopefully paint onto this. Hide those splines. You don't want to see the magic, how the magic trick's made. And then, yeah, there we go. So we can see now this is the essentials of the stenciling. And we're getting full coverage. And remember, we've got a lot of particles sat on here, so we might need to work on some sort of efficiencies, optimizations, that kind of stuff. But overall, I'm pretty happy with how that's looking. What I might do is I might focus in the particles a touch more than they are now. So I'm just going to jump into our random blend. And I'm going to change that to 0.6. Oh, sorry, 0.06. Quite a sensitive parameter, that one. There we go. So we get this nice looking painting at the beginning. And then paints all of that. And it's readable at the moment. That's a good sign, of course. We could crank the number of particles, and we probably will. So we might go for sort of 40,000 particles maybe. That'll get a bit slower, of course, but it'll give us much more accuracy. And the thing is that we're not actually going to be leaving particles on this surface. And you could render these. So because we've got these as assigned groups. So what I'll do is I'll create a change group so that this painted group is a separate group. Let's jump into the collider. Let's add another action. Now, where's that action gone? That's probably gone down into... Where did it go? Oh, because it didn't know where it was supposed to be. We weren't in a system or anything. It went to the top of the hierarchy. And I wasn't paying attention. So we need to change this group. So let's make this one stencil, because this is the change group stencil. And this one's going to be change group action. Which one? Painted group. There we go. So let's now make this a direct action, change group, and then it's going to be the painted group. Groups is the new group. There we go. So now we should see 3 separations of color if I actually display this one. Let's do dots. Oh yeah, red. Red is what we were using previously. There we go. So I can now see our 3 separated particle systems. We've got the initial one, which is the spray can group, the collided initial stencil group, which sits away from the surface, and then the actual surface painted group, which is going to be important in a minute. There we go. And I could cache this out, get a good real-time playback. Something I want to just talk about is actually the surface of the stencil is going to need to be painted as well. So if you recall, I've given this surface some decent level of subdivision, which we probably will increase even more than that, because we're going to have vertex maps being created. And this one it's using an n-gon. So if we want any painted vertex maps on this one, we're just going to have one addressable n-gon, which is not going to be good enough. So what we'll do, go back to the beginning here. I'm going to go turn it to quadrangle mode in the caps. And you can see here we've got a bit of a mess going on. That would work, but it would be very messy and you get streaks of weird vertex maps. So we're going to change this to regular grid, and I'm going to change the width to, well, let's say 2 for now, and then we'll go down as we progress later on. And if you look at my stencil, I've actually got this set up to, so default is adaptive. And if we've got it on adaptive, obviously on these big long shapes, there's not going to be a single subdivision all the way along. So if you look, you get these really stretched out polygons. That looks like a single stroke line there. And they're actually, can you see that? That's not good topology, especially if you're deforming, colliding, that kind of stuff. So what we'll do is we will go back to the stencil, spline, go change it to subdivided mode. And then generally I match this. The angle is not so much of a problem. In fact, you could set that to like a high value, but you know, leave it on whatever the default is, that's fine. And then I tend to match roughly the maximum length with whatever I set the regular grid length. Now it doesn't need to be absolutely perfect. I mean, this is not the prettiest topology, and you're absolutely welcome to go and retopologize this to the nth degree. I actually wouldn't recommend it because I think it's going to be a waste of time in this particular instance, but each their own on this stuff. Because when we subdivide more, you'll see that we get, you know, a decent level of polygons to collide with and add vertex weight to. All right, so that's pretty much our setup ready to go. What I want to do is I'm going to be animating this on and off, so I'll bring on some, probably just use a bend deformer to kind of peel this off and peel it back on again. It's going to be quite abstract. It's not, you know, perfect real world stuff. For one, I don't think our stencil would, well, maybe our stencil's made out of steel, in which case we probably shouldn't be bending it. But yeah. So hopefully this has given you a good intro to the idea of the stenciling. But there is another level to this that I want to take us to in part 2 of this second part, if you like. And that is how we're going to transfer the particles into a vertex map so that we can use that as in the render engine, because rendering these particles on the surface might not look great. So yeah, we'll call this one complete, and then we'll do a part 2 with the vertex maps transferring the paint to that surface. See you in the next one.